She walked the aisle with her head down, her hands clasped tightly around a faded leather wallet. The only sound accompanying her footsteps was the hush of disbelief rippling through the cabin. Escorted out of first class like a criminal, she didn't cry, didn't shout. But the silence around her was heavy, suffocating. Their eyes, sharp, judgmental, and unapologetically cold, followed her every step. A man in a navy suit raised an eyebrow. A woman whispered behind a manicured hand. No one stood up, no one asked why. To them, she didn't belong there. Her sweatpants, her plain sweatshirt, her dark skin, these things had decided her worth before she even sat down. But what no one on that plane knew was that her silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Because the man waiting on the other side of the landing strip wasn't just her husband. He owned the plane and the entire airline. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. And stay tuned for a story that proves dignity walks louder than arrogance. Aisha Grant was the kind of woman whose presence didn't scream power. It whispered it. At 32, she had lived many lives in one. A former nonprofit founder, a quiet philanthropist, and the wife of one of the most influential men in aviation, Aisha could have adorned herself in designer coats and diamonds if she wanted. But today, like most days, she chose a faded navy sweatshirt, soft gray sweatpants, and a plain black baseball cap that shadowed her calm, expressive eyes. Her beauty wasn't in her clothes or her jewelry. It was in her poise, in the way she moved with quiet certainty, in the kind of grace that didn't need validation. But the world rarely looked past surface details. And Aisha knew that. It was why, as she stood in line at the gate, surrounded by briefcases, Rolex watches, and practiced smiles, she sent a simple message to her husband. "Let's see how today goes." The flight she boarded was a luxury one, sleek, polished, and humming with the unspoken rituals of the elite. The first-class cabin was lined with deep leather seats, chilled glasses of champagne, and passengers who wore their wealth like second skin. Men in tailored suits, women in cashmere scarves, all giving subtle side-eyes to anything or anyone that didn't fit the mold. Among them moved Rachel, a blonde flight attendant in her early 30s with perfect posture and a uniform that was always pressed to military precision. Rachel didn't hate anyone. She just believed in a certain look for first class, a curated image of class and polish she'd been trained to maintain. When Aisha entered and took her seat quietly, by the window, Rachel's eyes narrowed just slightly. No confrontation, no words, just a pause. A pause heavy with doubt. To Rachel, it didn't make sense. This woman in sweats blending more with a jogging trail than an airline cabin that cost thousands per seat. The contrast was striking. Aisha's soft cottons next to the hard lines of Italian wool and silk ties. In that setting, clothing wasn't just fabric, it was permission. And Aisha, without knowing it, had stepped into a stage where her appearance would be mistaken for impropriety. As the plane began to fill, the mood inside the cabin settled into a familiar rhythm of murmurs, laptop screens, and self-importance. But beneath Aisha's calm, there was a ripple, a memory of how many times she'd been here before. Misjudged, looked over, reduced to someone she was not. Her jaw clenched slightly as she looked out the window, the clouds beginning to blur, as the engines came to life. She didn't know it yet, but this flight would challenge more than her patience. It would test the world's understanding of dignity, The cabin had just begun to settle when a suited man in seat 2A leaned toward Rachel and whispered, barely hiding his smirk, "Someone's in the wrong seat." His tone wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the hum of overhead bins and safety announcements. Rachel glanced toward the back, then turned her eyes to Aisha, seated quietly by the window in 1C, her hands resting on a small leather clutch. She wasn't speaking, wasn't bothering anyone, just watching the clouds roll across the tarmac. Rachel approached with that rehearsed smile flight attendants wear when they're about to ask something they've already decided. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said lightly. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" Aisha blinked once, slowly, then reached into her bag without hesitation. "Of course," she replied, her voice soft, steady. The pass was crisp, clearly printed, clearly marked. First class, seat 1C. Rachel held it longer than necessary, her eyes scanning not just the ticket but the woman holding it. "I see. It's just, sometimes these get mixed up at check-in," she said, her voice dipped in politeness but laced with doubt. Aisha said nothing. She only looked back at Rachel with the kind of patience worn by someone too familiar with being second-guessed. The silence stretched between them, taut and uncomfortable. "Would you mind just stepping out for a moment while we verify everything?" Rachel asked, already motioning toward the aisle. Aisha paused. She could have spoken then, could have reminded this woman of her rights, her name, her husband's title. But instead, she exhaled softly, unclipped her seatbelt, and stood. The cabin wasn't loud, but the shift in energy was deafening. People looked up from their phones, raised eyebrows, exchanged glances. One woman snorted under her breath. Another man shook his head with amusement. And Aisha, dressed in soft grays and navy blues, walked past them all like a storm cloud swallowed by the sun. As she stepped into the aisle, Rachel leaned in, her voice low and brittle with control. "Let's not make a scene." Aisha didn't flinch. That sentence lingered in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to admit was burning. She walked silently down the aisle, not looking left or right, her shoes brushing against the plush carpet as if she were trying not to disturb the illusion of civility. And yet, with every step, her dignity screamed louder than any protest. She didn't need to defend herself. Not yet. The truth, she knew, always finds its way. Slipping into an empty seat in economy without a word, she pulled out her phone, her thumbs moving quickly. Just 3 words this time. It's happening again. Across the country, in a sleek glass tower overlooking the skyline, Julian Grant sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, surrounded by executives and lawyers who spoke in clipped tones and pointed jargon. The boardroom buzzed with talks of mergers, routes, and future projections, until his phone vibrated once. He glanced down and saw her name, Aisha, and beneath it 3 words that made his entire posture change. It's happening again. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He simply placed his phone face down on the table and rose from his chair. The voices around him faded as he buttoned his jacket and said, without emotion, "Reschedule this meeting, all of it." No questions were asked. No one dared. Because Julian didn't need to raise his voice to move a mountain. He only had to decide it was time. Back in the air, the flight cruised steadily, drinks being poured, seats reclining. But a sudden buzz through the crew's communication system caused a ripple among the staff. Rachel was called to the cockpit. The captain's face was pale, lips tight. "We've just received a direct order," he said, sliding over his screen. Rachel leaned in, reading the message. Her throat dried. The name at the bottom wasn't just familiar. It was one she saw printed on every internal document, every corporate signature. Julian Grant. And the message was short. "Handle this immediately." Rachel's footsteps were slower as she returned to the cabin. Her stride, once firm and clipped, had lost its rhythm. She reached economy and stood beside Aisha, whose gaze was calm but unreadable. The surrounding passengers perked up, sensing a shift. "Ma'am," Rachel said, forcing a smile that trembled at the edges. "There's been a mistake. We apologize. You may return to your seat now." She gestured back toward first class like she was offering a gift. But Aisha didn't move. She looked up at her with eyes that held decades of restraint, pain, and experience. And with a voice so gentle it cut through the charade, she replied, "I'll stay here." The silence that followed was dense. It wasn't just refusal. It was a quiet rebellion. Aisha hadn't just declined a seat. She had declined the game. Rachel stood frozen, unsure whether to argue or retreat. In first class, someone whispered, "What's happening?" A man leaned over to the person next to him and muttered, "Who is she?" The energy in the cabin shifted from judgment to confusion, then something closer to regret. A few people began to replay their earlier glances, their assumptions. Rachel turned without another word and walked away, her spine not as straight, her steps less sure. Aisha sat still, hands folded neatly in her lap, staring out the window. The sky was a soft silver beyond the clouds. And though she was seated among strangers in a space she hadn't paid to enter, she held more power than anyone else on that plane. Not because she'd spoken, but because she hadn't needed to. The transformation wasn't loud. It was slow, graceful, and complete. The wheels touched down with a gentle thud, but the tension in the cabin was anything but soft. Passengers stirred, unbuckling their belts prematurely, adjusting their jackets, brushing away the stale air of judgment they'd worn like cologne throughout the flight. But this landing wasn't like any other. Instead of taxiing to a gate, the plane rolled to a quiet stop on the open tarmac. Curious glances exchanged across aisles. A hush spread like fog when the doors opened. Not to the tunnel of the terminal, but to the bright, blinding light of flashbulbs and the sharp silhouettes of men in dark suits. Standing at the foot of the stairs was Julian Grant, tall, composed, and unmistakably in command, flanked by press cameras and airline executives who looked like they'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Rachel stood frozen near the galley, her hands gripping the service cart, as if the metal could steady her spinning thoughts. Her eyes widened in disbelief when Julian ascended the staircase, not even glancing her way, and walked straight to the economy cabin. The passengers turned like a wave, heads swiveling in unison as Julian reached row 17 and stopped. Without a word, he reached for Aisha's hand, pulled her gently to her feet, and embraced her, deeply, protectively, lovingly. The same woman they had questioned, side-eyed and humiliated, was now held in the arms of the man who wrote the checks that kept this airline in the sky. Julian turned to face them, his voice calm but unshakably clear. "I'm Julian Grant," he said, meeting the eyes of those who had watched her walk the aisle in shame. "And this airline made the mistake of questioning my wife's dignity." The silence was instant, absolute. No one moved, no one blinked. What had started as a routine flight had turned into a lesson wrapped in velvet and steel. The very space that once pulsed with quiet smugness was now filled with a stillness that revealed something deeper: shame, reflection, and awe. Aisha didn't gloat. She didn't glare. She simply nodded once to the passengers as Julian led her, gently out of the aircraft, his hand on her back, guiding her past Rachel, who stood stiff, lips parted but without words. It wasn't revenge. It was revelation, and it arrived not through noise, but through silence so profound it echoed louder than any apology ever could. The storm didn't come with press conferences or breaking headlines. It came with quiet. Restructuring, internal memos, and names quietly shuffled on corporate documents. Rachel was not fired publicly or dragged through shame, but her days at the front of the cabin quietly ended. She was reassigned, given a new role away from passengers, and weeks later enrolled in a mandatory anti-bias program. At first, she resented it. But the sessions were unlike anything she expected. She heard stories. She listened to pain. She saw herself reflected in the uncomfortable silence between assumptions and consequences. Slowly, the edges of her pride began to soften. She started to see, and understanding, at last, began to replace judgment. Aisha and Julian, meanwhile, issued only one statement to the press: brief, powerful, and rooted in grace. This wasn't about a seat, Julian said, standing beside his wife. It was about who people think deserves one. Aisha didn't speak much that day. She didn't need to. Her presence said it all. When asked if she planned to take legal action or demand firings, she shook her head gently. Dignity doesn't need destruction to prove a point, she said quietly. It needs clarity and change. The media praised her restraint, but, more importantly, the industry listened. Within weeks, the airline implemented sweeping reforms: anti-bias training for all crew, a passenger dignity clause, and a formal grievance system that didn't require a public scene to be heard. And then, like all great moments, the world moved on. But something had shifted beneath the surface. A few weeks later, Aisha boarded another flight, this time on a quiet morning. No photographers, no press, just her, a carry-on, and the same navy sweatshirt and gray sweatpants. She walked toward the gate unnoticed until the attendant at the counter looked up, smiled warmly, and said, "Welcome back, Mrs. Grant." No questions, no scanning glances, just acknowledgement. On board, she found her seat, again in first class, and sank into it with a quiet sigh. As the other passengers settled in, a small voice from economy carried forward. A little girl, no older than 6, tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "That's the lady who stood up without yelling." Her mother smiled and nodded, casting a respectful glance toward Aisha. Aisha turned slightly, just enough to catch the child's eyes, and smiled. Then she closed her own eyes, leaned back, and let the hum of the engines fill the space around her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't being watched. She was simply seen. And in that moment, soft, still, and weightless, she was free. In a world that often judges worth by appearance, where silence is mistaken for weakness and simplicity, for insignificance, Aisha Grant reminded us all that true strength doesn't always announce itself. It walks quietly, carries itself with dignity, and lets truth rise above noise. She didn't need a courtroom or a microphone. She didn't demand retribution or revenge. Instead, she chose presence over protest, grace over aggression, and Doing so, she shifted not only the room, but the system that built it. Her journey wasn't about reclaiming a seat, it was about reclaiming the right to exist without apology, to be seen without suspicion, and to walk without explanation. In a world that sees only surfaces, Aisha proved you don't need to shout to be heard. Have you ever been misjudged based on how you looked? How did you respond? We'd love to hear your story. If this one touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that quiet strength can change everything. Every share helps bring these stories of truth and dignity to more people who need to hear them. Thank you for being with us. More real stories, more real change coming soon.